This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Our first speaker is Dr. Christy Kokigi, who's someone I know well. We did our honours together, and we now work together at History SA, where Christy is the web coordinator, among other things. She's also very patient with colleagues who ring up and ask silly questions about how do you make that thing work again. But she's here because of the thesis that she's recently completed, and she'll be speaking on a topic related to that, looking at the policy of migration assimilation, which dominates Australian post-war immigration historiography, and I'll let her tell you more about her thoughts on that as she goes on. So welcome, Christy.
Thank you, Catherine. Can everyone hear me? I realise that I'm often a very quiet speaker. And I will just apologise in advance. I've got a terrible sinus infection at the moment, so at some point I will have to stop and probably blow my nose, and it won't be pretty, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I'll try and step away from the mic. Okay, so as Catherine said, I'm sort of reflecting on assimilationist discourse. I won't bore you too much with theory today. Really what I want to look at is the specific example of Lutheran responses to post-war immigration in the period 1945 to 1960, very loosely. So first, I suppose, to get a quick sense of this period, 1950s Australian immigration history, the perceived orthodoxy is that of a dogmatic drive for migrant assimilation into the existing culture. In terms of the historiography, we have post-war immigration, which is loosely divided into three periods. We have the assimilation through the 50s, and then we progressively move towards integration of migrants during the 60s, and then through the 70s and 80s we get this more enlightened multicultural era. And for the most part, the historiography reflects this evolution of immigration policy. So against this body of scholarship, and particularly the harsh and discriminatory nature of official assimilationist policy in the 50s, that I would actually argue there was in practice a concern for the welfare of migrants and an awareness of their needs at the differing levels of the policy's administration. Through the example of the Lutheran churches, because there are two Lutheran churches, and we'll explain that a little later, we get a sense of how migrants were received, how policy was being interpreted, and finally, how that was then implemented on the ground at a community level. And the point, I guess, that I want to arrive at today is that rather than understanding the period as a singularly dogmatic xenophobic drive for cultural assimilation, there was this very real and shifting gap between the rhetoric of the policymakers and the actual practice at the differing levels of its administration, which ultimately served to liberalise what had been seen as a very illiberal policy of migrant assimilation throughout the 50s. Okay, so in terms of the Lutheran responses, what I want to look at is that during the 50s, there are these two Lutheran churches in Australia who were early advocates of the immigration program, and they enthusiastically sought to minister to the post-war migrant community, and especially, in this case, the German migrant community. So, secondly, I guess what we'll look at today is how post-war immigration brought the two Lutheran churches closer together. It forced them to cooperate in ways that they hadn't for a very long time. Both churches established immigration boards early in the period, and through these boards they formalised working relationships with each other to better meet the needs of Lutheran migrants. So what we see in these early years of the church's involvement in receiving and settling migrants is the beginnings of a collaborative approach by both churches, which ultimately impacts significantly on the eventual amalgamation of them into one Lutheran Church of Australia by 1966. Okay. So just quickly, a little bit of background about the Lutheran Church in Australia. I'm sure plenty of you here know this already, but I'll just briefly recap. So obviously there's a long tradition of Lutheranism in Australia, originated with the arrival of Pastor Carville and his Lutherans to South Australia in 1838. And through the mid to late 1800s, the Lutheran Church in Australia was characterised by a multitude of semi-independent synods. But by the early 20th century, two distinct rival churches had emerged nationally. We have the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, or ELCA, as I'll refer to them, which was established in the 1860s, and then its 20th century rival, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, which was formed in 1921. Okay. So having flourished initially, the growth of Lutheranism was hampered by the First and Second World Wars here in Australia, when German identity in Australia was dealt a crippling blow. German Australians were interned, German Lutheran schools were closed, relations with Germany were prohibited, explicit allegiance to Australia was demanded of Lutherans, and so on and so on. I mean, the response is well documented. So it was against this backdrop, though, that German migrants in particular began arriving in Australia in the 1950s to a very tentative German community and a divided Lutheran church, in danger of losing its cultural and linguistic foundations after the effects of two world wars. The arrival of over 100,000 German migrants after 1945 brought with it for the churches a chance at regeneration and a broadening of their congregational bases. So, how did the two Lutheran synods proceed? And what was their involvement in assimilation and settlement processes? So early in the period, around 1947 to 48, so the beginnings of the Displaced Persons Scheme, the Australian government, and specifically the then Minister for Immigration, resisted Lutheran requests to become involved in the immigration and assimilation programs. Minister Colwell personally rejected applications for publication of German language welcome pamphlets, dismissed suggestions of Lutheran-sponsored child migration and the establishment of new Lutheran schools, as well as discouraging sponsored German refugee schemes with organisations such as the internationally recognised Lutheran World Federation. However, by 1949, the government had relaxed this position and was starting to give approval for the issuing of landing permits for church-sponsored German migrants and starting to enter into a dialogue with both Lutheran churches about their involvement. So Colwell saw Lutheranism as tightly associated with Germany, and at least where the UELCA, or the United Evangelical Lutheran Church, was concerned, decidedly political in nature. This, he reasoned, was a direct impediment to migrant assimilation in the post-war years. However, as I said, within the space of a few short years, the government's attitude towards Lutheran involvement had changed significantly. And I think this is representative of a wider shift that we see in the government's approach at the time. I mean, we have the realisation that the displaced persons and the British migration schemes alone couldn't sustain the immigration program on the scale needed to meet labour demands, and that the government would need to turn to other European countries for migrants. So similarly, the government acknowledged that it alone and its administrative bodies could not meet the assimilation and settlement needs of migrants during this time, and that it would need to rely on established community groups and organisations throughout Australia to do this important work. So organisations such as the well-established two Lutheran churches in Australia. So during 1948 and 49, provision had already been made for the two large denominational churches, being the Lutheran and Catholic churches, to station chaplains and pastors at Bonegilla Migrant Reception Centre, and this is the Lutheran church at Bonegilla in 1955. These church officers were afforded free lodgings and board for their work with migrants at the centre. UELCA, on the appointment of Pastor Bruno Mutzelfeld, and I'm very sorry I'll be pronouncing German names terribly incorrectly, I'm sure, but on the appointment of Pastor Mutzelfeld to Bonegilla in 1948, Colwell had written to the UELCA president expressing his appreciation for the involvement of the church, which he now believed would greatly assist not only in providing for the migrants' spiritual needs, but also in facilitating their rapid assimilation into Australia. Within a month of Mutzelfeld's appointment to Bonegilla, Colwell had granted places to pastors at Bathurst Migrant Camp in New South Wales and various other camps, migrant reception centres. And then we get a change of government to Menzies in late 1949, and Harold Holt is appointed as Minister of Immigration. And after this, we see a really progressive shift towards the provision of administrative scaffolding, I guess, that enables and entrusts local community groups with the government's nationally important task of migrant assimilation. So while the government continually offers up this rhetoric of assimilation during the 50s, I mean, in the public, in its documents, you know, in a lot of their documentary evidence, it was increasingly left to the people on the ground to interpret and perhaps even mediate the message in their dealings with migrants. So we have, by the early 50s, we have the beginnings of Lutheran involvement in the immigration program, with the two churches well established in Australian society and with access to appropriate administrative and community channels to effectively assist migrants. So earlier I touched on the fact that the two migrant boards were cooperating they were coordinating their response to the migrant presence in the post-war period. And a reading of the minutes of these two boards throughout the 1950s, their circulars, letters, miscellaneous notes, all of their correspondence in the archives, is quite clear that both churches early recognised the need to work together to present a united Lutheran front to migrants. In 1949, at a joint meeting of the two church migration boards, it was concluded that a divided church was confusing for migrants and not conducive to increasing membership. Ultimately, at this meeting, it was agreed that the goal should be one Lutheran church in Australia. In January 1952, the two boards articulated their immediate goals, which were to work together for migrants, to present a united front when dealing with the government, to publish a joint leaflet for new migrants, and to avoid overlapping of their work as much as possible. They met these goals in a number of ways, including cooperating and taking it in turns, providing Lutheran pastors for the migrant ships coming out to Australia, coordination of pastoral and congregational support to migrants in the regions, and the publishing of a joint welcome pamphlet titled Australian Lutherans Greet the Newcomers. The pamphlet, which was published in line with the policy of both migration boards, included a joint greeting from the two presidents. Okay, so by 1952, when the first German assisted passage migrants start arriving in Australia, the two church boards have already established a pattern of working together to receive migrants. The pastors are located in hostels on ships. They're greeting migrants at train stations and docks. They're visiting worker camps and employees across the country. By now, they've made arrangements with Commonwealth social workers to stay informed of migrants moving into their areas and to have cases referred to them where appropriate. They've established good working relationships with the fledgling Good Neighbour Councils and the New Settlers Leagues. They're represented at the Australian Citizenship Conventions, and they've established their own migrant boards to coordinate and facilitate their work. And generally, the wealth of administrative and community experience in dealing with migrants that we see at this time is being communicated up and down the food chain, and by and large, the Department of Immigration is facilitating this at a few levels. Okay, so, where am I going? Okay, so during my research, I spent considerable time at the Lutheran Archives, reading through over a decade's worth of publications from both the ELCA and UELCA churches, and including things like their monthly and bi-monthly publications, the Australian Lutheran and the Lutheran Herald. These were subscription-based papers that went out to Australian Lutheran households across the country. And in them, I found copious examples of both churches' commitment to the welfare support and pastoral care of migrants. And it was through these publications that the churches communicated their work with migrants to the wider Australian community, and they really kept it at the fore of what they were doing. And you could now, I totally understand. You could argue that this type of evidence is self-serving, and that it was in the church's interest to depict their work in the best possible light. But I think what shines through time and again in all of these publications is that both churches, their pastors and their congregational members, saw it as their charitable Christian duty to help refugees and migrants, and not only migrants arriving in Australia, but throughout Europe as well, rather than it being their duty as Australian citizens to assimilate European migrants. And they don't employ this heavy assimilationist rhetoric in their daily practices at all. Now, obviously, both Lutheran churches' responses to immigration in this period bring with them they've got clear motivations towards growing their congregational ranks and strengthening the position of Lutheranism in Australia. But what they didn't initially count on was the general weakened religious attachment of these migrants, or indeed the sheer volume of the practical and pastoral support that they would find themselves administering on a daily basis. So if we look at a few brief examples of this, what we'll see is that through their work in assimilating migrants into the existing Australian culture, the Lutheran Church, and I would argue like many other organisations who were on the ground dealing with migrants, and this includes some public servants and government departments at the Commonwealth and state level, they interpreted this policy far more liberally. And really it was about necessitating the provision of settlement services and counselling services and welfare support to migrants with a view to understanding the migrant experience and how these experiences were impacting on the migrants' ability to settle successfully in post-war Australia. Okay. So if we look a little closer at the provision of welfare and pastoral support to migrants in the churches. In the 1950s, having been exposed... 5 minutes? Okay. In the 1950s, having been exposed to many thousands of migrants coming through the reception centre already, the Bonegilla Congregational Committee, so this is the churches who have been installed at Bonegilla to work with migrants, they recognised early on the importance of providing basic care and support to migrants, writing that they come to the pastor with innumerable questions and perplexities which are by no means connected with a clergyman's duty. If he can't give them the correct answers and explanations, they lose confidence and there will be little chance of any approach to spiritual matters by either party. In that same year, the UELCA reported that pastoral care of migrants was now being undertaken by their pastors in the interest of spiritual work. They listed examples of assistance in bringing migrants' relatives to Australia, the provision of interpreting services for migrants and government officials, the obtaining of financial assistance for the erection of family homes, and the placing of wives and children in the country, closer to where their husbands and fathers were working. One Adelaide pastor, Max Picure of the, and again I'm probably pronouncing it terribly, of the Elka Bethlehem Church, felt keenly the importance of this pastoral work. He reported in a nationally distributed publication, Migrant Messenger, that hours upon hours of the pastor's time go into all manner of practical aid problems. Accommodation, employment, building, passages from Europe, land and language problems come almost every day. He also touched on the growing dialogue developing with the Australian government and other community bodies engaged in the field of migrant settlement, recording that a daily average of 14 phone calls come from government departments and welfare bodies asking for help, advice and attendance. So there were obviously many problems intrinsic to the displacement and migration process that added substantially to a pastor's duties. And this included quite substantially marriage counselling of migrants. Picure wrote in 1954 that, quote, "unhappy and broken marriages keep the pastor busy deep into the night," end quote. This occurrence was similarly noted by departmental social workers across Australia who were employed by the Commonwealth Government to work with migrants in the immediate post-war years. Early social worker caseloads were dominated by marital problems, with reports of marital discord most common where partners had met in DP camps in Europe and married after only a short time before realising that they weren't well suited. Similarly, it was reported that significant national tensions existed that commonly threatened these marital unions. And so the experience of dealing with these problems was then being communicated by all of these individuals, through the citizenship conventions, through the Good Neighbour Councils, through these really informal networks that were sort of proliferating at the time. And a lot of this was being fed back to the Department of Immigration at the national level. And I would argue that there was a change or a gradual liberalisation of policy as a result of this fluid dialogue that was evolving during the 50s. Not saying it was perfect, but it's kind of interesting to look at that dialogue. All right. Other major issues that occupied considerable church time and effort were the addressing of the weakened religious attachment of many post-war migrants. A variety of evidence in the various church circulars, papers, correspondence and annual reports attest to this. One such example that demonstrates how far removed from the assimilationist rhetoric both churches' approaches were comes from Victoria, where it was reported to readers in the Lutheran Herald in 1950 that migrants' religious convictions are gone, their moral judgments are warped, the battle against sin has been too strong for them, the spirits have been lying too long broken before being healed, their family life has been cruelly disrupted, their minds have been demoralised through evil association. And this pastor appealed to his Australian Lutheran community time and again to help these lost souls by fostering a better understanding of the migrant situation and by gaining their confidence and friendship. And there are some other local examples through the Uelka Pastor Zimbauer here in Adelaide, who many of you probably know is a well-known German refugee of Nazism in 1940s who was subsequently interned here in Australia. However, in the post-war years, he and his wife worked tirelessly amongst the migrant population in Adelaide. And he commented quite early that it was only, quote, it was only natural that people have been upset by their continual wanderings and the camp life, and that, quote, we must not blind ourselves to the fact that some people might attend church services and functions because of the personal popularity of the minister, advantages from membership, and the provision of a meeting place of the nationals. Zimbauer recommended in his annual report as early as 1950 that more be done to meet the pastoral needs of migrants, including more intensified house visiting, as well as children and youth work, and ultimately through the training of migrant pastors to minister to the growing number of migrant congregations across Australia. Now, there are a number of other examples of this kind of work, but I'll just skip through. Okay. So I guess just to conclude, we started by looking broadly at how this, and very briefly, at how this period of Australian immigration history has been commonly perceived as one of harsh, discriminatory administration of government policy, and how the dogmatic character of assimilationist rhetoric left no room for understanding or negotiating the needs of migrants. We then looked briefly at and again very briefly, at the response of Australian Lutheranism to the immigration program and to the policy of assimilation. And what we see is that while both churches encountered government opposition early on, this soon gave way to support and cooperation. And in turn, this enabled the churches to respond to the migrant presence by placing their pastors in migrant camps and hostels, on ships, encouraging the proliferation of German language publications and sermons in the migrants' native languages, the sponsoring of pastors and indeed refugees from Germany, and the provision of pastoral and spiritual support to migrants generally. So this pragmatic approach to post-war migrant reception by both churches contributes to our understanding of assimilation policy as it was interpreted and implemented at the local and community levels. It's demonstrative of a broader pattern of operation and the emergence of this shifting gap between the rhetoric of the policymakers and the implementation of policy on the ground. This is one very small example, but ultimately I think if we content ourselves with the simplistic reading of assimilation as the logical conclusion of government rhetoric, we're obscuring the development of fluid and largely pragmatic approaches to migrant reception and settlement here in Australia that ultimately serve to incrementally liberalise immigration policy that until quite recently had been viewed as a rather illiberal approach to migrant assimilation. Thank you.